In the heart of Africa, known today as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, lies a country with a rich colonial history. It was once a case study displaying the detriments of European colonization, but has since slipped out of societal memory. What role did King Leopold II of Belgium play in the Congo's history? Who was Patrice Lumumba and why was he assassinated? Some say it started in 1884 during the Berlin Conference. Others disagree. My name is Alexandra, and this is the Cartographer's Guide. In this video, I'll be discussing the colonial history of the Congo. It's going to be a 2 or 3 part series because my laptop probably can't handle an hour of footage. I've learned a lot researching this topic, so stick around and hopefully you'll learn something too. The Congo, as in the country, gets its name from the Great Congo River, which supports the expansive fertile rainforest that makes up the Congo Basin. For the sake of simplicity in this video, I'll just say the Congo, and I'm referring to the territory that's today known as the Democratic Republic of the Congo. This is also because the Congo has received numerous different name changes since its colonization in 1885, and it's simpler if I just refer to the Congo, otherwise I'll add something like the Congo River, the Congo Basin, you get it. The Congo lies on the equator, smack dab in the center of Africa. This provides the perfect conditions for the great rainforest that exists there. In fact, the Congo Basin is one of the largest carbon sinks in the world. If you don't know what a carbon sink is, it is a region that takes in more carbon dioxide than it releases, making it essential for supporting life on Earth. However, colonizers were far more interested in the profits and saw the Congo as a perfect opportunity to extract their natural resources. Elephant poaching skyrocketed as ivory became more fashionable in the West. Demand also increased for rubber and metals. The Katanga province in the southeast still contributes to the bulk of the country's economic output. Its mines provide roughly 10% of the world's copper and roughly 34% of the world's cobalt. But before we get into the history of the Congo, there are some people I need to introduce you to first. Starting off at the top of the social hierarchy, we have King Leopold II of Belgium. King Leopold II of Belgium was the King of Belgium, but the thing is, Belgium was just recently gained its own independence from the Netherlands, and its system of government was a constitutional monarchy. This devalued the power of the king, and he didn't enjoy that very much. As most leaders during this time, they wanted money and wealth and power and all of that. Meanwhile, he was looking around, and the European scramble for Africa started to emerge during this time, and he thought that this was his perfect opportunity. That being said, it's not really something that the public would approve of, and he's going to need sponsors and all these different things to gain control of a territory in Africa. So, he began to spread this idea that we should civilize Africa, and we're going to bolster the African economy and use anti-slavery means to do so. This was a pretty good strategy given that sentiments around slavery were changing, especially after the American Civil War. During a Belgian Senate meeting, he said, quote, "I will secure to Central Africa the blessing of a civilized government." These actions were the first steps in gaining the public's favor. Moving on, we have Patrice Lumumba. And Lumumba was very much a self-made man. He was born in the very small town, or village, I guess, of Honolulu, which is kind of in the center of the Congo. He worked his way up. I guess it's not the corporate ladder, but it works in a similar way. He worked his way up as an évolué, and that's a French word which essentially means the evolved but pertaining to African men. The way that one goes about becoming an évolué or evolved, and pardon if I'm saying that wrong. So the way that he became this evolved man was by doing things like eating European food, wearing European clothes. He learned French. It was basically becoming evolved, as they put it, from a native African to a Westerner. Throughout Lumumba's political career, he began to self-identify as a Congolese nationalist, or Pan-African nationalist, as he often put it. And this meant that he put his country, his continent, first over just about all the other politics going on in the world. This meant that he wasn't afraid to kind of bargain with the Soviets. That being said, he also didn't shy away from American or other Western powers. Moving on, we have a man who was born Joseph Mobutu, but later in his life changed his name. I'm not going to try to pronounce his name because I'm probably going to butcher it terribly. Here in the subtitles, I have the entirety of his name, or at least like the name that he gave himself. I'm not going to try to pronounce it because I'm going to butcher it terribly, but it translates into English as, quote, "the all-powerful warrior who, because of his endurance and inflexible will to win, goes from conquest to conquest, leaving fire in his wake." But before he changed his name, before his political life, he served in the Force Publique, which was essentially the military in the Congo. It was first created by King Leopold, but did not go away when the Belgians took control of the territory. The Force Publique was kind of infamous for being unnecessarily violent, and it was very, very corrupt. They were less concerned about keeping peace and more concerned with keeping obedience. That being said, Mobutu didn't stick around for a very long time. He quit and became a journalist, and that was what he did for a very, very long time. However, one day he stumbled into Patrice Lumumba, and as sentiments of independence and growing Congolese nationalism began to rise up, Mobutu was convinced by Lumumba to kind of start going into politics. In fact, when Lumumba became prime minister, Mobutu was placed in the position of Secretary of State. Later on, he became the president of the DRC, which he then changed the name to Zari. Next up here, we have Joseph Kabila, and he's actually kind of trending in the news right now because he's currently being tried for treason. There's a few other things that he's being tried for, but we're not going to get into that right now. I believe that he's first been accused on the 26th of July, 2025. But his political life kind of began when his father was assassinated. His father was in charge of a very prominent group, an ethnic group, and when he died, he just kind of inherited all of that power. Eventually, he became president and brought about relative stability. However, he did step down in 2018 for Felix Tshisekedi, I believe that's how you pronounce his name, marking the first genuine multi-party election in over 40 years. Last, and definitely not least in the realm of influence, we have Henry Morton Stanley, and Stanley became this very notorious figure because everything that Leopold was able to do was achieved through Stanley. So essentially, if Stanley wasn't there, the Congo probably never would have been colonized. And we're gonna get to him. He pops up many, many times throughout this video, so I'm not gonna say too much about him right now. The biggest thing is that he provided the treaties for King Leopold that he used to take control of the Congo territory. Alright, so now we're gonna look at the actual series of events that have landed the Congo to what it has become today. Alright, so starting off in 1885, King Leopold gained personal control of the Congo. We're going to get into all of these later, so I'm just going to kind of list them off here. So then in 1908, Belgium gained control of the Belgian Congo. It's kind of interesting how that happens. And then in 1960, specifically July 30th, independence is gained and the Congo, or the Belgian Congo, becomes the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In 1961, Patrice Lumumba is assassinated. In 1965, Joseph Mobutu rises to power and renames the Democratic Republic of the Congo to Zari in 1971, again with the changing of the names. And then in 1996, the first Congo War happens, and then that is followed 2 years later by the second Congo War, which goes until 2003. And then in 2018, Felix Tshisekedi wins the election against Joseph Kabila, which marks the first genuine election in over 4 decades. And then from 2023 to right now, rebel groups, particularly on the eastern side of the Congo, have been causing a lot of instability in the country. Alright, so King Leopold II's acquisition and exploitation of the Congo Free State actually begins back in 1876. Remember, he has to gain support, resources, all this stuff for him to gain this territory. So we gotta go back to the Brussels Geographic Conference. And you could kind of put this into the perspective of kind of being the pre-Berlin Conference, which we'll also get into later. So the Brussels Geographic Conference was this convention of European explorers and European leaders to kind of discuss their all of their involvement in Africa and kind of start to brainstorm what that's going to look like. Remember, the scramble for Africa is kind of starting to emerge pretty quickly here, and everybody kind of wants to gain part of the profits. So, the International African Association became established. Essentially, this was the first kind of agreement of how colonization in Africa was going to look. So, some general agreements that they came up with, most of which were not followed, were the abolition of the slave trade, the bringing of humanitarian funds and resources and humanitarian aid, again, for civilizing Africa. And the other thing was bringing Christianity to Africa, which kind of goes hand in hand. However, in all honesty, the Brussels Geographic Conference and the International African Association was really just a giant PR strategy, and it put Belgium, particularly King Leopold, on the map. While this was all going on, King Leopold had already made a deal with Henry Morton Stanley. So essentially, Stanley was going around what would become the territory of the Congo and making deals with the African chiefs and leaders, essentially giving away their entire land, all the stake to their land, and signing it over to King Leopold. Now, in case you're curious on how the heck he managed to do this, there were plenty of tactics that he used. The big one was language barrier. He had people sign things that were written in French that the natives did not know. Second one was bribes. They would bribe the leaders and not give anything of substance to the actual people. They also used mercenaries to kind of just go in and say, do this or we'll kill you. And then malintentioned trades. This was essentially giving something worthless, but making it sound like it's this really cool thing, if that makes sense. But probably the biggest, most mind-boggling one here is the trickery and the fraud. So there were 3 tactics, which were, when they were released, they were known as acts, in reference to like a play or just like drama, because that was essentially what it was. It was very much fictional. So there were 3 big tactics that were used by Stanley on the African natives. The first one was he convinced the people that he could control the sun. So essentially what he did, he took his glasses, and glasses magnify things, right? So he took his glasses in one hand and a cigarette in the other, and he lined them up with the sun, and the sun rays hit the glasses, and like some people do this with ants, it makes the cigarette start to smoke. So this was how he convinced them that he controlled the sun, and he said, you either do what I say or I'll tell the sun to burn down your village. That was the first one. The second one was convincing the natives that Stanley, specifically, but white men in general, were actually spirits and could not be killed. They did this by taking a gun and taking the bullet out and putting it and basically replacing it with paper. It still had gunpowder in it, but it wasn't actually going to do anything. So he gave this gun with the fake bullet to the native and told the native, or more like the chief, to shoot him. They did, and he did not die because obviously paper is not lethal. Meanwhile, Stanley had hidden a real bullet in his sleeve, so then he pretended to reach down and pick up the bullet, really just like slipping out the real bullet from his sleeve and showing like, okay, this was the real bullet that you allegedly fired that doesn't kill me. That was the second thing they did. The third thing they did was they convinced them that white men are very much stronger, like physically stronger than the natives. And they did this by taking batteries, like electrical batteries that they got from London, and attaching them to Stanley's arm, but like hidden underneath his clothes with a ribbon attached, essentially meaning that when he goes to shake the hand of a native, there'll be like an electric jolt, and that'll make Stanley appear a lot stronger physically. And all of these methods were brought to light by George Washington Williams, or George W. Williams for simplicity, who we'll also get to later. But essentially he was an African-American journalist. He went down to the Congo to just see what was King Leopold's great Congo Free State, and he saw all these things and wrote an open letter, which is actually, if you look in the description, there's a link to a Google Doc with all the sources, like primary sources and such, that I used. and it's just George Washington Williams' open letter to King Leopold. And I'd actually recommend that you read it. It's very enlightening to just break down all the real stuff that was happening, especially given all the propaganda. And that's also, I also found a thing of Belgian propaganda, and it's also on the list, which you should also go read that, because that was what they were giving to the public. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So moving on to 1884 to 1885, this was the Berlin Conference, and a big misconception that even I considered myself to be under before I actually looked into it. It was this misconception that the Berlin Conference was the splitting up of the African territory. It was not. In reality, it was really just the creation of an official instruction manual for how European powers could go about colonizing. And you can still go find the actual document online. It's called the General Act of the Berlin Conference, and there were 7 chapters. We're going to get to the chapter 2 here in just a second, but the first chapter is just chapter 1, and it's talking about free trade within the basin. And I mean, that makes sense, because the entire reason why European powers want these African territories is to extract their raw materials for the purpose of trading and gaining wealth. Second chapter is no slave trade. This goes in with the whole PR strategy that I was talking about earlier. And this, what I have pulled up on the screen, is 99% of the topic of slavery in the entire document. So this really just says 3 things. 1, the trading of slaves is forbidden. And by the way, if you want to read this entire thing, feel free. It's a lot of words to say very, very little. So it says 1, trading of slaves is forbidden in the colonized territories. The territories that are colonized may not serve as a market or means for transit for slaves, and any European power that is colonizing must stamp out the slave trade if they see it. And when I say this is kind of a PR strategy, the Europeans were not the only ones who were practicing the slave trade. Arab slave traders were also very, very prominent. So that was kind of like their excuse, like, okay, we're going to stamp out slavery, but they were kind of doing this forced labor thing on the side that wasn't really slavery, but it was kind of slavery. And then chapter 3 on the act was neutrality, which was basically ensuring that the territories weren't going to have conflict with each other. And again, this was just ensuring that everything is solely focused on extracting these raw materials and gaining profits. Now, side note, it's a little bit difficult to bring all of these different ethnic groups together and expect that they're all going to get along just fine. If you didn't know, the Congo alone is comprised of over 100 different ethnic groups, and that's one of the reasons why they still have so much conflict there today, is because when these borders were drawn, they had all these different ethnic groups that they just merged together. So some groups got separated, some groups got grouped together with rival tribes. It was not good, it was not thought through. But that was just what chapter 3 was discussing. Chapter 4 and 5 were maintaining that there would be free trade within the Congo River and the Niger River, which were the 2 big river systems in Africa. And chapter 6 was this thing with occupants, essentially saying if you are putting your flag on a territory, you have to have your own people there to kind of maintain all these laws. Then chapter 7, I just labeled this as admin. This is stuff like how we can amend the contract. Chapters like this exist in a lot of documents, so there's not much substance there. Moving on to the Congo Free State and what was actually happening down there. So there were 3 big things that were being extracted from the Congo Basin, particularly the Congo Free State. The first one, ivory, appealed to the upper class. Ivory was considered a luxury product. It was used on piano keys. It was used as jewelry. All these very expensive, nice things that kind of just said exotic. That was what was fashionable, and therefore what was being extracted. Another material being extracted in bulk was palm oil, and palm oil was also in high demand because, it's the Industrial Revolution. It was put in every condiment under the sun. It was put in soaps, candles, and it was also used in the food industry to help preserve things in canned foods. But the most prominent material that was being extracted out of the Congo Free State was actually wild rubber. Wild rubber was both the source of the majority of the profits that were being made in the Congo Free State, but it was also the largest smoking gun once everything got exposed. And the reason for this was the way that wild rubber was harvested. Harvesting wild rubber took an insane amount of manpower because it was so dangerous. Instead of the rubber trees that you and I might think of today in the Congo, rubber had to be extracted from these vines. And so what they would do is they would slash open these vines and then rub the latex that ran out of it onto their skin. Once the latex solidified, they would need to take a knife and scrape it off of their skin. The entire process was agonizingly painful and very, very difficult to do. I mentioned earlier that slavery, in the entire definition of the word, was not being practiced. People did not own other people in the Congo. Instead, what happened was that the force publique, which, as I mentioned earlier, was the police force in the Congo, they would take women and children hostage and then make the husbands go out and collect all this rubber. Every village had a quota as a tax that they needed to supply in rubber, and punishments for failing to meet that were often the amputation of hands. And if you look into what made the Congo Free State so notorious, you'll often see these piles and piles of hands that had been chopped off. Mostly this was used as a terror-inducing tactic just to get people to go and do the work, and it's the reason why the Congo Free State had so many human rights violations, why for so long it was just this huge humanitarian problem. And all of these issues combined resulted in the death of 50% of the Congolese population in less than 23 years. Knowing the outrage that would occur if people were to find out about the brutalities happening in the Congo, Leopold organized a huge propaganda campaign. What I have up here is a single paragraph from an entire report that was published, and I'm going to read to you a few of these sentences. Quote, "What was before a wilderness has now been made a garden. The districts formerly devastated by the Arab slave raiders are now inhabited by natives who live in security and peace. Cannibalism and human sacrifice are rapidly disappearing. The country has been opened up to Christianity, commerce, and civilization." This was the kind of rhetoric that was being given to Westerners, just ordinary citizens like you and I. This single report is 10 pages long. With statements like this coming out for years and years, people had very, very little cause for concern. This little ruse continues until 1908, and this was when the Belgians kind of took control away from Leopold, which was mostly due to discovery. I mean, eventually this stuff always gets out, and in the case of the Congo, there are two very influential people that we need to discuss. Starting off here with Edmond de Morel, and Morel is often the one who is given most of the credit for bringing this story to light. He's famously described as being on this dock in Liverpool, which is in the UK, and he recounts seeing all these ships coming back from the Congo with all these resources and seeing all this trade that's happening. But then he started to notice that the ships going back to Congo weren't full of riches and stuff to trade. Instead, they were full of guns and chains and manacles. He ended up putting two and two together and realizing that this was not how it seemed. He did a little bit more research and discovered all the treacherous things that were happening in the Congo Free State, and he started bringing it to light. He founded the Congo Reform Association, which had the main goal of getting humanitarian aid into the Congo and making sure that King Leopold was no longer able to continue this huge civil rights violation. However, while Morel was very influential in Europe, George W. Williams, who I mentioned earlier, was the leading figure of the Americas. As I mentioned before, he was an African-American man, but more than that, he was born in Pennsylvania. He fought in the U.S. Civil War, but after the war, he became a journalist. Mostly, he was discussing African-American history and all of that. And then, one day, he went to Belgium, he met with King Leopold, and the two of them actually got on very, very well. He refers to King Leopold in his open letter as a friend many times, both at the beginning and at the end. However, in this open letter, which in full is titled, quote, "An open letter to His Serene Majesty Leopold II, King of the Belgians and Sovereign of the Independent State of Congo," So you should totally go read it. But essentially what it does is lays out all the different ways that King Leopold has violated international contracts. Just 2 examples of which are 1, firing bullets on natives who, in the anecdote that were mentioned, were just in canoes. The second one is quartering members of the force publique in villages. Third one is producing propaganda with Henry Morton Stanley. And a fourth is taking part in huge civil rights violations. But again, those are just 4 of the offenses that George Williams lays out. I'd seriously recommend going to read it if this is a topic that's interesting for you. So as you can probably imagine, when the scandal was brought to light, it caused major uproar. Public pressure forced European leaders to demand that control over the Congo Free State was transferred over from King Leopold to the Belgian state. I scavenged the internet looking for some official document moving power from Leopold to the Belgians, and I think I found it here. The only problem, though, is that it's in French, and I can't read French. I can barely read English. So if you can read French, the link to this document is with the others. Just push on the link down below. And it's just like the Colonial Charter. And I'd actually love to, if you could let me know in the comment section if you can speak French and went to go read it. I can't find an English version. I'll probably still go look for one after this. But that's beside the point. The important thing to know about the Belgians taking control over the Congo is that Belgium continued to use the same tactics that Leopold did to extract raw materials. That didn't go away with the transfer of power. Really, it was just a tap on the head for the global community to get them to shut up again. These continued terrible tactics that were being used were one of the driving forces of Congolese independence in 1960. But we're actually going to wrap up this first episode here on November 15th, 1908, when Belgium officially renamed the Congo Free State to become the Belgian Congo. This ended up being much longer than I had originally anticipated it to be. So if you stuck around this far, thank you so much. Let me know if you enjoyed it and what I should study next. I am going to be releasing, hopefully, 1 or 2 more videos on the Congo and just the history of it. And then I also might start looking into what's happening in the Congo today. So let me know if you're interested. Again, thank you so much for sticking around, and I will see you in another video.